If over the past few years you've watched people who think of themselves as principled, shrugging at deportations that move forward without actually going through the legal process that gives people the right to challenge them, and you've thought, how does this not register as a moral contradiction? There's a theory to help explain that. In social psychology, there's a concept known as the scope of justice, which is also sometimes called moral circles. The idea is simple and helpful and devastating, and that is that we draw boundaries around who we think fairness applies to. And inside that boundary, rights feel sacred, and outside that boundary, rights feel negotiable. But of course, this framework makes the most sense when you place it along the work of scholars like Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson, and Khalil Gibran Mohammed, whose work illuminates the long-standing history of racial boundary making in the United States. A lot of people in the history of this country have always had a racially bounded moral circle. This is not new. This is foundational to the history of the country. Enslaved people were legally excluded from personhood. Indigenous nations were pushed outside of constitutional protection. And racist immigration laws have always decided who is acceptable and who is deemed as a threat. Racism is one of the most effective tools to shrink the moral circle. But now, a lot of the time, you often hear it's not about race, they broke the law. And this is, again, not new. As books like The New Jim Crow have explored and argued brilliantly, labeling a group as criminal has long functioned as a more modern, socially acceptable way to strip away rights and sympathy while still giving the appearance of moral order. And once someone is categorized as a criminal, especially by a government agency, whether or not it's true, for some, their suffering becomes easier to rationalize, and due process starts to look optional. From inside the circle, people see themselves, maybe, I assume, as defending family stability, and that helps them keep their moral identity intact because the people who have been harmed fall outside of the boundary within which full rights feel urgent. I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm saying that's how it gets rationalized. And if you're following along with my spring syllabus for films for fighting fascism, and you're watching The Zone of Interest this week, you see how these things fit together. The film follows a family that considers itself decent and loving while maintaining their house abutting the wall of Auschwitz. The thing that's freaky about this movie is that it shows how banal, horrifying violence can become for those who lay outside the family's moral circle, from their ethical zone of interest. So I wanted to talk about moral circles not only because it helps us understand the film for this week, but for me, it also helps me understand the world around me a little bit better. Have you had a moment recently where somebody that you thought was morally upright said something that made you stop and think, wait, what? Let me know in the comments.